Yeah, so I'm Jon. I head up a small consultancy in London where we do infrastructure design, build, operate, scale, consult for a range of different businesses of different sizes. And we've had the mixed fortune in the last couple of years to work with companies who are in the financial sector and in the pharmaceutical world, both of them small companies selling to larger organizations, so they have all this regulatory stuff to cope with. And I'm hoping to share some of the stuff that we've learnt whilst working with those customers today. So in the next 40 minutes, we're going to take a look at what a regulated environment is. We're going to demonstrate that they suck and ask why that is. And then hopefully we're going to offer some insight into how we can make that suck a little bit less. We're not going to be talking in any deep detail about specific regulatory frameworks. So if you wanted to do that, then I feel really bad for you. That's not going to happen here today. We won't be talking about SharePoint, which seems to be the de facto kind of tool that big businesses use to put these kind of regulatory frameworks in place. That's definitely not on the table. And there won't be any actual puppets. If you've made it this far in Puppet Camp, expecting there to be like handheld little pieces of entertainment, I feel bad for you as well, but that's not happening either. So, regulatory environments, what are they? This is the Wikipedia definition. That's the best way to open a talk, is to copy some text from someone else's website. But essentially what this means is if you're operating infrastructure within a regulated environment, you don't make all the rules. You're following rules that are laid down for you by law or other sort of regulations that govern that particular market sector and the type of data that you work with. We can compare that to like your regular startups or your kind of social media or that sort of thing. There's much less in the way of regulatory compliance there. You can make all your own rules. In these regulated environments, you don't get to make your own rules. You have to play by theirs. And really, we're talking about these sorts of frameworks. There are obviously more, but these are healthcare and banking regulatory frameworks. So PCI DSS, if you're dealing with credit card details, ISO 27001, which is kind of a catch-all for loads of other industries. There's Sarbanes-Oxley there, and HIPAA, both of which are more relevant here than they are back at home, I guess. And really, these are industries in which there is a material impact that can be measured in either finance or safety or loss of life if these systems don't conform adequately to those rules. And we're talking about things like this. You know, you want to be not Sony in this particular scenario. They had a particularly bad year that year. And in this particular case, they lost 77 million user accounts, which was a bad morning for them. In the healthcare world, we're talking about this sort of thing. So like poor management of backup tapes led to leakage of information relating to healthcare, which was obviously a HIPAA breach. This website is, in fact, a website that is devoted entirely to talking about breaches of data against HIPAA, which makes interesting and harrowing reading if you ever want to dig that out. And this sort of thing, which isn't strictly speaking something that regulations are designed to protect against, but I find hilarious anyway, where a financial organization basically lost an assload of money overnight because of some poor computer management issues. So what we're saying really is that in a regulated environment, you're required to be cautious to an extent, and the level of caution is dictated to you by the rules. Going back to Luke's keynote this morning, the 2015 State of DevOps report, he mentioned there, if any of you were awake enough after your first coffee to listen to what was going on there. This was the 4th annual report. It's the measurement of around 20,000 IT professionals, and if you filled out the survey yourselves, which many of you may have done, you'll remember it was asking questions about working practices, asking questions about organizational performance. And in a follow-up blog on the Puppet Labs website, after this report was published, there was some additional sort of slicing and dicing of the data, and it was found that the survey respondents in 2 particular areas reported a disproportionately high percentage of low-performing IT. And any guesses? Healthcare, banking. So the 2 industries that we were talking about earlier that are covered by a lot of regulation also seem to correlate with low IT performance. I think it's important to ask, well, what do we mean by low performance? And in this particular case, the survey was concerned with deployment frequency. So how long does it, or how frequently are you able to make changes to your infrastructure? Deployment lead time, so how long are we waiting between wanting to make a change and actually being able to do so? And the mean time to recovery of dealing with an incident. So how long does it take, on average, to put the pieces back together when something goes on fire? And these three things have one sort of commonality amongst them, I think, and that commonality is change. This guy is Heraclitus. He was writing this stuff in about 500 BC. It's still true now. Everything changes all the time, pretty much. And change is how we add business value, responding to market forces and competition. All of that sort of stuff requires change. And I think it's entirely fair to say that regulated industries require just as much change as unregulated industries, whether that be patching or bug fixing or releasing new features. These are not industries that are standing still. They're just perhaps going a bit more slowly than most people would like. And certainly with our customers who are small and kind of agile-minded, they want to be able to move as quickly as a social media startup or whatever, even within the constraints of the regulations that they're working towards. So basically what we're saying is that regulated businesses are less good at change. And that's the summary of those findings, I think. And so let's have a think about why that might be the case. I think essentially it comes down to the fact that there's a lot more rules involved. And whenever you have a large number of rules to follow, something else springs up around those rules. And that's bureaucracy, which is, as far as I'm concerned, middle management who are in place specifically with a remit to manage all of these changes. And in a sort of bank or a large healthcare organisation, there will be teams of people who are responsible for keeping an eye on compliance. And they are, for the most part, bureaucrats. Any of you who've seen Office Space will recognise this guy. If you haven't seen Office Space, I recommend it. It is on Netflix. And Lundberg here is really concerned with how the TPS reports look and whether the right kind of cover is on them, etc. And so in these sort of organisations, what is referred to as change control is often implemented essentially as paperwork. It's Word documents and writing and kind of physical signatures and stuff. Changes need to go through change advisory boards and other sort of groups of people that kind of act as a choke point really for change. And so you modify the rate at which you're able to change things within these organisations because that process is inherently slow. And in many cases, depending on the types of things that you're changing, the overhead of paperwork and getting permission and talking to change advisory boards is actually much, much more effort than the change itself that you want to make, particularly if you're making kind of daily sort of infrastructural changes such as you might want to do with Puppet. The other aspect of this is that in a larger organisation, the implementation of the regulations often leads to a security posture that produces complex environments and complex architectures. And in some cases, and certainly we've seen this in the companies we've worked with, more complicated than is actually strictly necessary to meet the letter of the regulation. And so what I'd like you to consider, if you're someone who works in a regulated environment, is that paperwork doesn't in and of itself have any intrinsic value. It's not a sort of business driver. I'm not talking here about documentation, which is obviously useful and valuable in its own right. And I'm also not talking about process. I'm talking about the paperwork artifacts that can often fall out of these sorts of processes. They don't give you business value. And arguably the corollary to that is that people who are employed to generate paperwork also don't add any business value. So if we look at this sort of thing, this change control form, this is detail, for the most part, that could come from elsewhere. So there's a lot of stuff around what is the change, what is the thing that we're changing, what's the controlled item, what's the impact of this. And then there's a sort of collection of signatures, and this document has to sort of pass across a load of desks. And this sentence down at the bottom is brilliant. It's like, well, you'll sign this thing, and then you'll give this to this other guy, and this other guy will pass it over here. And really, this is a piece of paper. It doesn't control anything in and of itself. And I think the same is true of workflow systems that don't integrate with the technology that they're working with. So your kind of SharePoints, which I said we weren't going to talk about, but I'm going to talk about it derisively. If you're building a workflow engine in SharePoint where you're collecting this information, but the electronic capture of that information doesn't seed the technological implementation of the change in any way at all, it's kind of pointless. As an aside, I have a friend who works in the banking industry where they're kind of experimenting with DevOps, and so they've automated their changes into their development and staging environments, but they're not permitted to make those changes themselves in production. So the thing that they've automated is the generation of their SharePoint documents, which are then implemented by hand by someone in the ops team. And if that's how you're doing your change control, you're going to have a bad time. I feel very sorry for you. So how do we fix this? That's the real question. This was important to us because, as I say, we were working with a small organization who were agile friendly. They're sort of startup-y mindset. It's a kind of Ruby on Rails, Postgres kind of shop, and they're selling a software as a service platform to large pharmaceutical companies. And so they have to conform with a number of FDA regulations. And so we were keen to be able to do things our usual way, which is quick DevOps Puppet stuff, without having to stumble over too much in the way of regulatory framework. So the answers to these sort of questions, as is always the case in the DevOps world, I think, is that the solution's slightly human, it's slightly technology, and it's all rules-based. And I'm going to apologise for using a picture from the remake of RoboCop, which was not as good, but it was the only film I could find a high-resolution image from. So I'm not going to cover in huge detail the actual Puppet stuff that we did. You can talk to me about that afterwards, possibly over a beer. But we are going to talk about essentially the philosophy by which we put together this sort of framework, and hopefully that will be, I guess, more useful to you. So the first thing that we did, or that rather the company we were working for did, was to find a tame auditor. So they found a guy who knew all of these regulations. He'd worked in the industry for probably 20 years, was technology aware, not to the extent that perhaps you or I are, but literate in technology and has worked with Unix systems previously. But specifically familiar with the regulatory environment. And crucially, in the case of this chap, open-minded, so willing to kind of question the things that he thought he knew and go back and look at the documentation and figure out whether or not what we were saying was crazy or whether it could be implemented well. As well as doing that, it's important to read the regulations that you're required to follow. I've worked in organizations where the change management and the sort of process stuff has come about almost by word of mouth. Someone said, oh, we have to do this because the rules say we have to do that. Unless you know the regulations, you're not going to be able to address concerns like that. And we'll see shortly that what we're trying to do is to simplify an understanding of the regulations as far as possible so that you only have to implement the minimum viable set of systems to meet those requirements. So you do have to read them yourself. They're quite dry, they're not very interesting. But actually, certainly in the pharmaceutical world, we're dealing with an FDA instrument called CFR 21 Part 11, which is actually quite a short document. It's this sort of thing. Each of these links off to another few pages in which there are bullet points about logging, auditing, access control, those sorts of things. But it's not a big, complicated document. It's quite dry. It's a federal instrument. It's not that exciting to read, but it's not very long, and you can get your head around it reasonably well. So one of the controls for electronic records for closed systems, that turns into this, which is basically you need Logstash with some security around it. You know, it's all reasonably sensible stuff. Having read the regulations, it's important then to go away and understand why they are there. Like, why do they exist? Be the child in that sort of relationship. Going, why is that? Why is that? Why is that? And make sure that the pet auditor that you found can answer some of those questions, because if they can't, they probably won't be able to help you justify what you've done to an auditor in a customer environment or from the FDA themselves. What usually happens with these sorts of regulatory environments, regulatory documents, is that in a large organization, they are interpreted by a CIO or a team of security people who'll then turn those into internal regulations. So you're going to have to read those as well, particularly if you're selling into an organization where that forms part of your contract. So the external regulations, the CFR 21, for example, is really generally about what you need to do, but not really how to implement it. Often the internal regulations will cover the how. And the how is things like, that's security, mention of security previously, it says it's secure, auditable, log, blah. This internal reg will tell you exactly how you're going to implement that security. Is it a particular type of crypto? Do you need a particular key length? Any of those sorts of details. Once you've read those internal regulations and you've got your head around them, and this is the part that is, I think, important. It's easy for me to do as a consultant because I'm an outsider, but if you're working within an organization where you're employed and you've been told that you need to conform to these CIO's rules, you need to challenge them. Particularly if you've taken the time to understand the regulation and the intent of it. If you come across something in those documents that just doesn't seem to make sense, it's important to say, well, I don't think that makes sense, and here's why, and be able to back that up with an explanation that's based on your understanding of the regulations. That's what your pet auditor's for, to kind of just help you justify that stuff. In particular, certainly in some of the larger pharma companies that we've had to deal with, some of their internal documentation are things like you will use an intrusion detection piece of software or appliance from this vendor. And vendor-specific stuff in these sorts of documents are not very helpful. Particularly in a DevOps world and an open source world, they're quite expensive and they're often hostile to automation. And so one example of that is that we looked at the requirements, and actually what you want is an intrusion detection service, and here are the open source alternatives. It might make the audit a little bit more difficult, but it means that this startup company doesn't have to spend 5 or 6 figures a year on an appliance just because it ticks the box easily for the auditor at the customer's company. Simplification is important because the simpler something is, the easier it is to reason about. The easier it is to reason about, the easier it is to audit. And that's really what you're aiming for here, is to reduce the amount of time that you spend talking to people about audit stuff. Challenging this stuff also helps you avoid situations like this, where the implementation details say, there must be a roller shutter on the car park. Okay? Right, there's no fences. Don't just sort of blindly implement these things. Clearly, the intent is there must be a barrier to entrance to the car park, but the implication is also there should probably be some security around the car park as well. There's no point conforming to broken or insufficient guidelines, and this stuff is just embarrassing. The other thing that we've encouraged is implementation of processes in an electronic rather than social way. And what I mean here is that if there is some aspect of change control that you want to apply to a platform, you apply that using the electronic tools that you're using to make the change. So if change must only happen in a particular window, configure your CI server, which should be the only source of change, to not allow people to make change outside that window. Like, easy stuff. If you have a group of people who are acting as a change advisory board or should be the gatekeeper to all changes, only allow those people to run the jobs that will make the change on the live platform. By putting those safeguards in place and being able to demonstrate them to an auditor, you can demonstrate that you've put all this process in place without there also having to be a load of paperwork to back it up. I think social controls are not useful, and a social control is something like a Jira or a SharePoint workflow system that doesn't actually push any buttons at the other end of it. It's literally just there to capture information, and that information is often available elsewhere, and that's not a good use of your time. So if you can demonstrate that control exists, it becomes easier to audit. The other aspect of social contracts around change is this sort of thing. This is the we call line of intent. If you're walking through this park, and this is going to be a tortuous analogy, I'm sorry, obviously the easy way to get from where you are to where you want to be is across this bit of grass that everybody else has walked over and kind of trodden a new path. In the sort of traditional InfoSec compliance world, what's likely to happen as a result of that is that someone will build a massive fence around that bit of grass, and you won't be able to walk on it anymore. In doing that, your engineers who are going to be making those changes, the people who want to walk that way, are going to be frustrated. And if you are working with people who are being pushed into this sort of bureaucratic mold, you're fairly likely to have churn on staff. People don't want to work in that environment, or the people that want to work in that environment are people who lack initiative and who just need that kind of guideline. They're not really good at thinking for themselves. So my view, if we're going to torture this analogy a bit more, is that the right approach here is to just pave that path, make that path the right way of making change, because it's obviously the way that people want to go. And in doing so and legitimizing that path, you make life easier for yourself, and things become easier to audit. So let's talk about actual technology. That's why you're here, I guess. Obviously, we use Puppet for our infrastructure. I'm not going to go into detail about what Puppet is because you're all at PuppetConf, but the fact that it can enforce a desired state and converge on a desired state, we found is really easy for auditors to understand, particularly when you demonstrate the idempotent nature of it, whereby running it a second time doesn't change anything. That's kind of how change managers have always assumed computers work anyway. It's only been true more recently. And things like your periodic runs or no-op runs or use of PuppetDB for auditing, as in electronically auditing, gives your auditor a good sense of security. The caveat to this, and the thing that we found when we were working on the Puppet for this particular client, up until that point, we've been reasonably happy with Puppet manifests that kind of work eventually if you run Puppet enough times. And I'm sure we've all been there. In this environment, because our change processes require us to demonstrate a working run of Puppet and a zero exit code, we had to up our game on testing, we had to up our game on idempotence, we had to up our game on quality. And in doing that, we made life a lot easier for ourselves across the board, but it did mean that we had to spend some time with things like Beaker and RSpec Puppet. We work heavily with Vagrant for running tests, so that by the time we've pushed a change into the production environment, it's already been through a number of environments in which it looks similar and succeeded. Otherwise, you have an exception report to raise, and nobody wants to be there, because that's paperwork for the sake of paperwork. The other thing that it's important to do is to make sure you're version controlling all your Puppet manifests. I'm assuming everybody's doing that. It would be crazy not to be these days. But the use of infrastructure as code and GitHub and that sort of thing allows an identifiable individual to be linked with a specific change and a pull request that describes what that change looks like and why. And that forms the majority of the information that a change control form would request from you. So the auditor, when you go through this stuff, can be shown the change itself and the intent behind the change and the individual responsible for that change. When we run these sort of changes through Jenkins to be deployed, the individual who set off that change into production can also be identified, and it can all be tied back to the original intent. So we believe in generating reports and not forms. If you think about that change control form we were talking about earlier on, and we consider the intent of that regulation, the intent is to be aware of what's changed, limit who can make change, and to see why things are changing. Implementing a report track instead of a paperwork gate, if you like, provides the same information. It hits the intent, but it provides less process overhead, so your changes can be quicker. And the auditors that we've run this by ultimately have been fine with it. They understand that the paperwork is not a useful thing in and of itself, but the process is, and by making the process electronic, everything is more predictable. What it does mean is that the things that we're reporting on, so stuff like Jenkins runs, whereas in a less regulated environment, you might consider your Jenkins workspaces to be disposable, where you kind of blow them away if you have any kind of problem. In this sort of world, we have to back up all of that stuff and keep the Jenkins logs for as long as we need to keep the system logs, which is a thing that is regulated for depending on the type of information that they contain. So in providing a reporting path, we've paved that line of intent. We want to be able to make change easily using DevOps tooling, and in order to do that within the regulatory framework, we have to generate documentational artifacts, but those can be automated, and that makes your life a lot easier. Another aspect of this is that you need a really strong identity management of some description. We use 389DS, which is what was Netscape Directory Server and is Fedora Directory Server, and that's basically an LDAP directory. We use complicated password aging and complexity rules that have been laid down by the organizational guidelines that recognize the implementation of the regulation. So your password has to have 16 characters and a certain number of numbers and passwords and expire after a certain amount of time, and all the other things that I would view to some extent as security theater, but people like to see. We've also added two-factor authentication. This particular customer uses YubiKey for access to their perimeter systems and to some of their Jenkins stuff. And we can use then that strong idea of identification to produce access controls within Jenkins to limit who can push changes and when. We have different groups of people who have different access to different types of machines, some people who can't get at production infrastructure but can get at staging infrastructure, etc. As part of doing this, we found that some of the systems that we wanted to use that were going to contain customer data, we were no longer able to use because there was no concept of identity within them. So any fellow MongoDB haters in the house? We had to kill MongoDB because you couldn't authenticate yourself against it. We now use Postgres in that environment instead. So another thing that's really audit-friendly is artifact-based deployment. So when we're making changes to Puppet or we're making changes to applications, we take the code from GitHub, and Jenkins will build the whole application or the whole set of Puppet manifests into an operating system package, which is then signed using keys on that machine and published into a private package repository. Jenkins will also take the fingerprint of that artifact. It keeps it in the workspace, so that's backed up. And we now provide all of our changes out into that infrastructure as packages containing changes. So we're never releasing diffs. There's no sort of rsync or Capistrano style deployment in there. We're always copying the entire thing out of the CI service and into the environment. And that means that you can always go back to a specific version. You can demonstrate what went out, what was in that package. Given an artifact, you can put that fingerprint into Jenkins. It will show you the job that built it. And it also means that we can then promote artifacts between environments. So we only have, we don't build packages on a per environment basis. We deploy a package per change. And the package itself flows through testing, staging, and into production. So we can validate the fact that the changes that we are making have been through a change cycle that is accurate and reasonable. And we use Hira for managing the variation between those environments in terms of addressing or what have you. But we try and limit the number of places where we need to do that. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about how we use Hira after we've finished here. The bit of CFR 21, part 11 that I put up earlier on was talking about log aggregation, so we have to do that. We ship logs from application servers out over syslog or using nxlog off of the machines and into a Logstash infrastructure. where we push those logs into Elasticsearch for searching with Kibana, and we also archive those logs so that they can be kept for the duration as required by the legislation, which is some enormous number of years that I don't even want to think about. There's also a requirement for those to be encrypted at rest, so we can do that. The other side effect of this, as probably many of you who are already doing these sorts of DevOpsy things know, is that then when you come to troubleshoot, you're not having to log into all sorts of different machines, which means that you can limit the footprint of users who are able to get into hardware because they're able to get all the information they actually need in a production system. We end up having to run a log stash in every environment because the security boundaries in that regulated environment are such that the logs can contain sensitive information from the application, and so the access to those logs needs to be controlled in the same way that we control access to the application data, which contains personally identifiable patient records. And so they're not allowed to leak out. We can't take them away, but they are accessible ephemerally. We also do loads of monitoring and alerting on stuff, as is standard good practice. Things that we do interestingly here that maybe not practice that you're currently implementing in your less secure environments. We do things like running port scans from every machine of every other machine. We log the results of that and compare them to the last run, so we can tell if new ports have opened up. And we're doing that by actually looking at the ports rather than just seeing if anything's open in the netstat. So we sort of sidestep the requirement to pay 50 grand a year for some kind of IDS by doing that. If you're working in a PCI card data environment, you might have a web application firewall that's filtering and alerting on strings that look like card data, and you'll want to periodically put a test card data path in there so that you can see whether that application firewall is working properly. And in doing this, you can point your auditor at a report that is the latest green run of all these tests, and that's a tick in the box. It's easy to understand because that information is compressed, and it's not just an enormous Word document about how clever you are, which has no intrinsic value, as we've discussed. We can also express security invariance in code. So by making these sorts of tests in things like server spec, we can run the same tests in our test environment as we can in our production environment. And all this stuff becomes really, really easy to justify to an auditor, particularly an auditor who is facing off against your pet auditor who's already gone through this learning experience where you kind of point at a page of green and say, this means things are good. And this small document describes why that is. Speaking of documentation, I like the concept of minimum viable documentation. I'm sick to death of people expecting and seeing documentation that basically copies and pastes stuff from other people's docs. And that seems to be prevalent in a heavily bureaucratic environment. Really, your documentation should provide jump-off points to documentation provided by vendors. It should also, rather than having a list of our machines are here and here are their IP addresses, what you really need to have in your minimum viable documentation is here is how I find out a list of my machines. And then you might go to PuppetDB or an mcollective ping or something else to locate those pieces of information. Paperwork jockeys love docs. They don't like the idea that you can get away with writing so little, but it turns out that actually, yes, you can. The important thing is that deployment documentation then becomes, go to this CI service, press these buttons if you're in this user group. And if you're working in an ITIL environment, that reduces all of your change management to what ITIL refers to as a standard change. And so the majority of stuff that you're doing can flow through the change process without really getting caught up in change advisory board stuff, unless you're doing big sweeping changes or you need to make manual adjustments to things or you have like architectural changes to make. So in the last, I guess, 35, 40 minutes, we've looked at the fact that regulated environments usually perform pretty badly. We've established that that's because change control is usually or often implemented with needless overheads. And I hope I've convinced you that good practice DevOps solutions can help and are justifiable to the right kind of auditor. It's worth paving the path rather than building the fence. That's me. We have another 10 minutes if there are questions from the floor. This chap down here, Zach, is going to run to you with a microphone.
Thank you. Great talk, first of all.
Thank you.
I have one question. I'm probably going to get killed by the audience here.
Or me.
Or you. A lot of what you're saying, I get the feeling we expect a fully mature development team. One of the reasons, and yes, I'm in banking, by the way. So one of the things that we see is because of A, the pressure to perform and to deliver, right, which is correct.
Yep.
B, our customers expecting functionality, today rather than, in 6 months.
Yep.
And C, having a very, very difficult environment to work in, both regulatory and technically. I mean, we're talking legacy systems that run code when most of us were not even born yet. So looking at all of this, bringing in all the automation and bringing all of that stuff in, it's not going to be something from today on tomorrow.
Yep.
So in the company that I work in, we are moving towards DevOps. We've actually done a full sweep in 10 months of the entire organization with the necessary chaos as a result. But now we're getting to that point, and my question really is how quickly should we move, and what are the milestones to tick before you can get to this ideal situation?
Sure. Okay. So I guess you're talking about a DevOps transformation, right? It's a kind of ongoing change process. It's definitely fair to say that the majority of experience that we've had in this space has been working with a brand new team. It's been setting their own goals and setting their own expectation for what quality looks like. Because they're a startup and they need to be efficient, and if you are starting from scratch, then you might as well not make the last 20 years with the mistakes that I guess the financial sector is living with at the moment because of the constraints you have. The organisations that I've worked with who have been in a bit of a mess from a systems perspective and have not been very DevOpsy, but also haven't been heavily regulated. They've had some ITIL and a couple of paperwork jockeys who aren't really adding any value. In those teams, it's taken about 3 years for them to get up to a proper kind of DevOps cadence and to have cross-functional teams and a kind of an atmosphere of sharing and an understanding that doing this right first time is the right answer. I think in banking, where you have legacy systems where you can't necessarily go back and retrofit automated processes, I think you just have to kind of suck it up and live with that for a bit, but ring-fence the new stuff that you're doing and require a good DevOps practice from there. And then perhaps go back and look at the things that are changing more frequently that are in your older environment that are perhaps not as old as the mainframes that you're trying to manage. I imagine Puppet Labs will sell you some professional expertise and software for going back and doing this kind of thing on your AIX machines or your IBM 360s or whatever it is you have to work with. But it's definitely true that in the DevOps community, we are guilty of solving problems for the modern general case in a world where everybody has control of everything. So I'm, I guess, preaching the happy path, but I think you can apply the happy path to new development even in old businesses where you're probably not going to be touching mainframes for the most part.
All right, so I also work in the banking industry. So at some point, the bureaucracy found out about this new thing called DevOps, and they decided that the bureaucracy department, the ones that do change control,
the Lumbergs,
were going to they were going to rename themselves DevOps.
Okay.
And they would have an automation team that would write quote unquote DevOps tools, like a tool that like as a developer, you open up and it tells you which forms to fill out to get work done.
Okay.
It doesn't actually fill them out for you. It just lines them up for you so that you can fill them out yourself. So how do I like pull the wool over their heads or like how do I convince them that the real version of DevOps is different from what they seem to think it is?
So that is a very good question. I mean, I have a certain amount of license to show up and throw my weight around being kind of an outsider. I think if you go and consult somewhere, you have a small time window in which you can have really strong opinions and put noses out of joint, and things kind of change around a little bit. If you're in an organization for too long, you become part of the furniture, people stop listening to you. I think in your situation, bringing those folks to other organizations or to DevOps meetups or whatever to sort of see what else is going on is valuable. I think there's an assumption in the regulated industries that this is completely unique. We're doing entirely new things like this. No one's ever done this before. And really, that's just not true. We're all pushing bits around at the end of the day. Some of us are just doing it more efficiently than others. And so I think that sort of culture of sharing that the DevOps community has kind of needs to expand into the sort of security and InfoSec and CIO world. And it's going to take some time. Like, you're going to live with that kind of pain for a while. But being able to measure how long things take is a useful exercise. So mapping that value stream and saying from the inception of a change through to it being deployed, here's how long it took, and here are the places where it was sat waiting for the longest. So you can map that on a Kanban board, and you can have your cards sort of building up behind the cab or whatever is causing you the most grief. But the trick then is to get licensed to pilot a project where you're going to do this stuff properly, and if you're able to stand up a new small organization to do good things around perhaps a low-value project or one that has fewer deadline requirements or whatever, and then demonstrate that the value stream maps much more efficiently in the newer world, then you can start kind of convincing people. Like, it's about data at the end of the day, and if you're working in banking with people who don't look at data as being worthwhile, then they should probably be fired. We have 3 minutes left. Is there any more questions from the floor? No? Well, thank you very much for your time.